yours based on the relative amount of time we've spent in the better area. It's very hard to implement kind of an experiment like that when kids have graduated and are choosing on their own where to move, right? So for instance, you might find that kids who move to Manhattan do really well. That's not necessarily because Manhattan is making them do really well. It's because they did really well growing up in Iowa that they got a job in Manhattan that's helping them succeed, right? So it's tricky to piece that out.
I wondered about that, and the brain drain issue that we have talked about here in Wisconsin as well.
Yeah, and I think the brain drain issue is a serious concern. A lot of rural Wisconsin producing great outcomes. What's happening there? 70% of those successful kids, they are not living in Wisconsin when we measure their earnings. They're living in Chicago, they're living in New York, they're living in San Francisco. So that's something I didn't emphasize, but we define areas based on where kids grow up, but then we track you no matter where you live in the U.S. And lots of the most successful kids, especially from rural areas, are living in a totally different place when we're seeing them at 30.
I think you went into this with the idea that you're going to look at tax expenditures. Do taxes have any impact on the numbers we've seen there?
Yes, and that's why I mentioned tax credits at the end. Taxes are potentially important, I think, especially insofar as they fund schools. And so we do find a significant correlation with local property tax rates. Places with higher property tax rates, which typically have better funded schools, tend to have better outcomes. But we see stronger correlations with many of the other factors, like direct measures of school quality, segregation, and so forth. So I think tax credits can potentially be a useful tool. But as I was saying, I think the solution here is not just to say we need to spend more money on our schools. It's that we need to spend more money effectively on our schools, focusing on certain aspects that really matter.
What about other kinds of social spending? Did you measure the impact of other kinds of spending on social issues?
Yeah, so one of the things we looked at, for example, is the size of local earned income tax credits that give low-income families additional assistance. Again, we didn't find nearly as large an impact as we do with some of these other factors. So simply giving families more money, that's actually what you might have thought at first glance might matter, right? We're seeing these really big differences in outcomes between low-income families and high-income families. What if we just try to close that gap in incomes by giving low-income families additional tax breaks and pulling up their resources? That doesn't have as large of an effect, I think, as some of these other factors.
And were you surprised by the variation around the country? I know I was when I saw it, and particularly, as you pointed out early on, that areas that economically seem to be doing well don't necessarily have high upward mobility. Were you surprised by the variation?
We were certainly very surprised, right? So we went into the project asking, is America the land of opportunity, which is the question many people have. It's not, is California the land of opportunity, or is Wisconsin the land of opportunity? But it turns out that that's very much the question it seems like you should be asking. And what struck me is not merely that there are large regional differences, but that there are very large differences within places that are a couple of hours of driving distance of each other. And moreover, as you pointed out, there's actually no correlation between average incomes in an area and levels of upward mobility. So that's why places like Raleigh and Charlotte and Atlanta, which we typically think of as booming cities, do not seem to be, better in this upward mobility measure. The way to think about it is Atlanta is producing a lot of good jobs and has a vibrant economy, but kids who grow up in Atlanta, unfortunately, when they're from disadvantaged families, are not doing so well.
This is something I don't think you looked at, but I'm wondering about it. Immigration. Does immigration, the passion, the energy of new residents in this country, does it fuel some of these cities? Does it contribute to better conditions, better opportunities for children as they grow up?
Yeah, it's a great question. We did look at immigration. So there are two things there. First, I think immigrants themselves tend to have high rates of upward mobility. That's perhaps not that surprising because they're very motivated, come to this country, and a lot of them are specifically looking to give their kids better opportunities and so on. But the fraction of immigrants in an area does not our hypothesis was very much aligned with yours, but in the end, the fraction of immigrants in an area is not that highly correlated with rates of upward mobility. And how can you see that? Take North Dakota, take Iowa. These are some of the places with the highest levels of upward mobility. they don't have very high immigrant shares. On the other hand, take San Jose or take the southern part of California, very high immigrant shares, and they do have high levels of upward mobility. So it doesn't seem to correlate systematically.
Well, another famous economist, Paul Krugman, in a column reacting to your study, essentially said that sprawl has killed Horatio Alger. And he's citing Atlanta, where there isn't good public transit and people tend to be segregated in pockets by income. So it's hard to get to where the jobs are. Is that a fair takeaway from your study? And
yes.
How does it apply to Milwaukee, too?
Yeah, so Paul is absolutely right that that correlation exists in the data. So one of the charts I didn't show you is that places with better public transportation or shorter commute times to work have significantly higher rates of upward mobility. And that's not surprising given what I showed you on segregation. Actually, it's the places that are less segregated that tend to be kind of these denser cities like Boston, for example, that end up having higher rates of upward mobility. And that's true in Milwaukee as well. Milwaukee is absolutely an example of that phenomenon. The tricky thing, though, and I want to emphasize this caution not to overstate our findings, is that you should not walk away from this thinking we should build a better public transportation system and that's what's going to change upward mobility in this city, because that's merely a correlation. Again, you're not sure if it's directly because of the fact that you have better public transit or it's something else that's different about these cities, like the less segregated cities have better interactions across people or better schools or better, stronger communities, none of which are going to be affected by building a better subway system, right? So that correlation is there, it's suggestive, but we don't know that public transit has a causal effect on outcomes.
I'm curious, what has been the reaction from some of these cities who have not fared well in your research? I mean, do the people in Atlanta have a reaction? Do the people in Charlotte say, hey, wait a second, that's not the Charlotte we know?
Right, so the mayor of Atlanta wrote a response to our study, which was interesting, and actually I thought fairly thoughtful. I mean, he did make the point that relative to much of the other Southeast, Atlanta doesn't look so bad, which is correct, and also that they're trying to do a number of things in Atlanta, and what I was really heartened by is I actually had a chance to meet him. He seemed quite motivated by this type of evidence to try to do something about it. I mean, that's our hope in measuring these types of statistics, is simply disseminating this type of information. I think people are proud, rightly so, of their cities, and they want to think, and they justifiably want to think of their city as a good place for kids from all backgrounds. And we're hoping that putting a spotlight on it might initiate change. On the flip side, it's been nice to see places like Dubuque, Iowa, proclaiming how they're at the top of this ranking and are the highest mobility places in the U.S.
We're from Dubuque and we're proud. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
So you have a number of factors that are correlated. Are you able to measure the extent to which they're correlated? So are some correlated more? And I wonder if you could talk a little more about that.
Sure, yeah. So on those slides, I wasn't emphasizing the numbers, but each of those charts had a measure of a correlation between the two factors. And the factors I chose to show you here were the 5 strongest correlates, all of which actually, for those of you who are following, have correlations of 0.6 or 0.7 with the upward mobility measure. Those are very high levels of correlation. One way to think about that intuitively is if I showed you a map of those factors, like the variation in school quality across the U.S. or variation in segregation, you would say, oh yeah, visually that map looks pretty similar to the map you showed me of upward mobility. There are lots of other factors we looked at, which I didn't mention here, that aren't that correlated, immigration rates being one of them. But another example, actually, which we were a little bit surprised by, is access to higher education in your area. So the reason I emphasize elementary education so much is we actually didn't find much of a correlation with the number of, say, community colleges or inexpensive access to higher education in your particular area, which is contrary maybe to what many people's intuition would have been. To me, it looks like it's primary schools where the interventions really pay off, at least for this population, relative to higher education.
So the bottom line here, as a former son of Milwaukee, I guess you'll always be a son of Milwaukee to some extent, but you would have this community focused like a laser, forgive me, on education, especially early education. Would that be the
yes,
way?
I would say education, and I would also say more broadly So let me say so more broadly and more specifically, let me make 2 points. So more broadly, I would say measurement of where things are going well and things are not going well is extremely valuable. And I think that's now feasible with the data we have. You can look at a very granular level at how teachers are doing. It doesn't need to be just based on test scores. It can be based on various other metrics. That's not to say, that teachers are not doing their best. I think many teachers are trying to do their best, but there are variations in quality of performance, just like there are variations in quality of performance in any other career. And this career is so important that I think it's extremely important to try to attract and keep top talent in teaching because of the number of people it impacts. But more generally, stepping back a little bit from that particular example, measurement of which communities are doing well within the city of Milwaukee, which schools are doing well. I think my sense is just having better information about what's working and what's not helps us learn and helps motivate people to make change.
Dave, final question?
I wonder where you go next with your research. You've emphasized that this isn't causation, it's correlation. Mm-hmm. Is causation next?
Yes, that's the hope. Level of causation in the education domain, and we feel fairly comfortable there, and that's why I think you're seeing some policy impacts already. What I'm trying to do in the coming years is focus specifically on the impacts of segregation. So we have an idea for a quasi-experiment on how you can vary the set of kids a child is exposed to in his neighborhood and in his school. So are you exposed to more affluent kids? Are you friends with more kids from diverse racial backgrounds? And then we'll be able to track these children over time and see if that's having a meaningful effect. And so we'll have a much better handle on whether direct interaction through mixed income neighborhoods is having measurable impacts. And then that can have potential policy implications, like you can try to change the zoning of school districts. Very politically challenging, but potentially important to get people more integrated. Or, some other places have busing policies and so on. So given the strong correlations we're seeing with segregation here, I want to try to get a causation on that dimension next.
I think what I'd like to do is use the remainder of our time to take a few audience questions. We have students who, get right to you, we have students who have microphones with them. Please raise your hand, hold it up. We'll make sure a student comes over and gets your question. Where are those students here? If we can start right with this gentleman right here, and then we'll move on up and we'll be sure to get over here.
It says, okay.
Yeah, there we go.
One of my concerns would be, first of all, I totally support the impact of highly effective teachers, but one might assume that there's an abundance of highly effective teachers. And so one of my concerns would be we go scrambling after this small percentage rather than going back to the teacher preparation institutions and really evaluating how well we're preparing teachers and who we're allowing to come into the profession.
So I absolutely agree. So that's why I was giving you that 5% example more as an illustration of the magnitude of impacts here rather than what I see as the key policy solution here. What you need, people often refer to the model of Finland, which turns out to be one of the places with the best education systems in the world. And from talking to people from Finland, what they tell you is that if you're a kid who's doing extremely well in Finland, your aspiration is to become a teacher if you're really successful. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way in the U.S. Many of the kids I teach at Harvard, their aspiration, they would like to potentially be teachers, but many of them end up going and working in other industries. And I think that stems from various factors. It's about the way teaching is perceived as a profession in the U.S. It's also, I think, partly the root cause is about salaries. The way salaries typically work in public schools in the U.S. is you get paid more as you're more experienced, right? But for a starting teacher, and often people are understandably focused on the income they're going to have when they start working, you're going to take a huge pay cut if you go into a public school relative to taking a job in finance or something else, which is a lot of what kids at top colleges are choosing between. And so changing the structure of pay and changing the selectivity of the teaching profession so that it becomes kind of the elite superstar profession where it's a privilege to be a teacher, I think that's really the ultimate solution. That's a harder thing, that's a more of a long-term goal than the shorter-term objective of measuring the quality of the teachers you have and trying to keep the better ones. But that's absolutely where we should be headed.
Let me can you come up this way? Because we've got a bunch of questions here. Let me go right here, and then we'll go over there, and we'll work our way around here. We'll get to you. Sorry.
Thank you.
For your patience.
So you mentioned how test scores in kindergarten were shown to be able to show income levels as adults. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if there might be an issue with the idea of maybe a psychological, if not actual, tracking of students, such that children who don't do very well in kindergarten and first and second grade end up kind of getting pushed into a situation where they're not expected to do that well, so they're not pushed to do that much, and they just kind of end up going down a bad path. What would you suggest that we do to try and not have things like that happen, so that you can't immediately assume that a child who's not doing so well in kindergarten isn't going to do well as an adult?
That's a really great question. So I think you're absolutely right that part of that correlation, it's not a deep fact. It could be because of the way our institutions are structured that we tend to track students in different ways depending upon how they're doing at early ages. But that's why the evidence I was showing you later on the teachers is very important, because it shows you that if by chance you get a good teacher later on, even if you weren't doing well in kindergarten, we can have a significant impact in moving you towards the right side on that graph, where your test scores start to go up very quickly if you get 1 or 2 or 3 better teachers. And so I think the solution here, while I'm not sure whether tracking is a good or bad idea, there are different sides to that debate that I won't get into here. I think what it shows is you shouldn't just take as a fact that kindergarten performance predicts later outcomes and sort of give up at that point, coming back to your earlier question, but rather later interventions, possibly through better teachers, but possibly through other interventions, can help kids do better and get them onto the better track, as you're saying.
Can we come on up? I'm going to split the two of you up and have one of you come over here, and I'm going to have you. This gentleman right here had his hand up right off the bat. So.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is, what are some of the successful models that you know that attracted good quality teachers into a school system? A. And the other one is that there's an urge to cut budgets.
Yeah.
I agree. Throwing more money at it is not the answer. But really cutting budgets, do they really help? Does austerity help? If so, how much?
On the first question, I think the best example I can give you comes back to Finland or to select schools in the U.S. that have been very effective in recruiting teachers. So, for instance, there are some charter schools which pay very high salaries that attract extremely effective teachers. I hesitate to generalize from that example, because if you take one charter school that's able to pay teachers 6-figure salaries, as there's an example in New York that does this, of course you're going to be able to attract all the highest quality teachers to your school, given that one school. But if every school started to do that, this is like a zero-sum game given the existing stock of teachers, right? You're just helping one school at the expense of other schools. So it's not obvious, it's not totally obvious that what would happen if everyone tried to do that. That's why I think the longer-term solution potentially involves paying higher salaries, but also it's something about prestige and how the profession is perceived and what people think of going into, which obviously is it's a vaguer concept and it's harder to figure out how to change that. But that's why I give the example of Finland as a place that has somehow managed to achieve that equilibrium, and that's where I think one has to be thinking about trying to shift in the long run. Higher salaries can be one step in that direction. On the budget issue, more money by itself doesn't help, but less money also by itself, it doesn't help, but it might not hurt. I think this is not about the level of spending, it's about the quality of spending. And I think it's true that it's tougher to make good spending decisions when you're forced to cut between worthy programs. So especially in the context of schools, I would think that's not what you want to cut given the long-run returns.
Right here.
sort of two questions. One, when you looked at upward mobility, you sort of looked at college attendance, but did you look at those students who really do not want to go to college, but they can go in apprenticeship programs and other kinds of programs where they still can make higher incomes or middle incomes, but they don't necessarily have to go to college? And then the other one issue that I found at suburban school, my son went to Nicolay High School, which is one of the, you would say, high-performing schools in the suburbs. However, they did have a tracking program, and they seemed to track more African American and Hispanic kids in the lower sort of their college-bound track, which is really not college-bound, track, than in any other the other track. So they also had college-bound, accelerated, and then their honors program. And that was one of the things we were sort of working at, how do you sort of mesh those together so that's not happening? Because we did notice that those kids who are in the college-bound were really not prepared for college.
Right. So on the first question, I think upward mobility varies just as much across places for kids who don't go to college. So the results that I was showing you on earnings, a lot of that comes through even for kids who don't go to college. You see significantly different outcomes for the kids who grow up in Salt Lake City versus Atlanta. So this is not just about which cities are getting kids to college. It's that and other factors as well. On the second question of tracking and whether helping kids prepare better for college can be valuable, absolutely. I think that makes sense intuitively. I don't have direct evidence for you on whether the return is higher there versus in some other part of the school system. But, one would think intuitively that you don't want to get kids enrolling in college who would have been better off just entering the labor force because they're not able to cut it in college. Again, in an era of tight budgets, it comes down to which of these things has the biggest payoff. And that, I think, is less clear.
The gentleman right there. I'm going to get over to that side of the room. I don't mean to.
Just to be granular for a second, I wonder if you have anything to say about class size.
So we find that class size has some impacts, but we find much bigger impacts of teacher quality. So let me put it this way. If you were to give me the choice between hiring one more teacher and thereby reducing the size of classes, but that teacher was of average quality or below average quality, I'd much rather have the kids stay with the higher quality teacher in the bigger class. So I think class size can help, but again, facing a trade-off, as we always do, I would pick teacher quality.
I have a question right here. Mm-hmm.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for making us aware of this. This is definitely something that's going to help us for our future and just in general. My question is, what would you think of the honors programs? These students often get the best professors, the best teachers in high school and even in college. And then the other students, the ones that are not in the honors program, just get the regular teachers. I personally have always been in the honors program. I've gotten great teachers that have helped me. But I always think of those other students that do not have the opportunity to get the feedback from these kinds of professors. In Finland, for example, even in South America, where I come from, we don't have that distinction. What they do is they find a good professor, and that professor teaches that one class to every one of the students, and they attempt to take the best out of the student. What would you say of that?
I think you're absolutely right that typically kids who are doing better in school tend to get better teachers, and what this does is that it further amplifies inequality over time, right? Now, it's a very tricky question from a policy point of view whether you want to go in the opposite direction or not, because it depends upon what your objectives are. If your objectives are to reduce inequality, then clearly I think your intuition is right that you'd want to assign the better teachers to the lower performing students. But you can also have another objective in mind, which is that we want to help the top-notch students really succeed and reach their potential, because those are the kids who are potentially going to invent new things or help society at a very broad level. and so maybe we should be directing our resources there. So that's a really tough trade-off. I think the better way to look at it is we need to have more effective teachers. Coming back to one of the early questions about increasing the pool of teaching quality, we need to have more effective education for the disadvantaged kids and not play this game of trying to switch the teachers around that we have within the schools.
I'm going to take just about 2 more questions. I want to get somebody over in the room. Yeah, we'll get that side of the room here, and maybe we'll come down front.
Hi, I was wondering if you examined family involvement or parent involvement, because you touched on it briefly, but how that can be an intervening variable in terms of looking at high-quality teachers, and if you have any plans to examine that more closely.
Yes, so parents are more important than teachers. That's clear in the data. And in fact, the way you know that is from experiments where you have adopted kids who ended up, due to random factors, getting different parents, and kids who were adopted by more educated, more affluent parents end up doing significantly better, much larger impacts than teachers, right? So, and that's, I mean, those of you who have kids, presumably that's very commensurate with your experience. From a policy point of view, it's hard to know what to make of that, right? I mean, people want to keep their kids. We're not going to change their parents. So, you know, I think family matters. I think maybe we should be trying to implement policies that improve family. That's much tougher to do than to try to change our schools.
Let me take one final question. This gentleman right down here.
Thank you for coming here today. I appreciated your lecture very much. I'm wondering, the American dream, as you study it, looks at it from a domestic point of view. Are you able to compare the results you've found from your research with international peers? And if so, how does the U.S. rank in terms of opportunities for social mobility versus international other nations?
So the U.S. does not actually rank very well relative to European countries, given limits on data. But one place where we have very good data actually is Denmark, where we have exactly the same data as we have in the U.S., and we've computed the same statistics I was showing you in Denmark. In Denmark, it matters much less what your parents' income is than in the U.S. So there are higher rates of relative income mobility in Denmark relative to the U.S. But, and this is what I want to stress, is that there are parts of the U.S. which look comparable to Denmark in terms of mobility, and there are parts of the U.S. which look like they have much lower mobility than any other developed country for which we currently have data. So many people talk in the policy debate about how the U.S. stacks up relative to other countries. And while that's somewhat interesting, really the answer to the question is much more complicated than that. And so I think the question for all of us is, what can we do to make those places in the U.S. that do have significantly lower rates of upward mobility look more like Denmark, but even more feasibly look more like Salt Lake City, like Iowa, like San Jose. And so my hope is sort of, let's recompute these statistics 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and hopefully what we're going to end up seeing is that places like Milwaukee are going to move significantly up in that chart. And I think that would really be a testament to the work of all the people in this room if we can achieve that.
I think we're going to wrap things up there. I just want to say a couple of very quick thank yous. Thanks to Dave Haynes from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Good to have you with us today. Thanks to all of you for your tremendous interest in this event. It's great to see, and we're glad so many of you could make it on a rainy afternoon. And most of all, I want to say thanks to Raj Chetty, the Harvard economist, professor, son of Brookfield, I guess I should say, not so much Milwaukee. But it's great to have you here, and thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.